I, like Hillary, am a self-described energy regulatory and policy nerd. I'm so happy to be here today to nerd out a little bit, hopefully not too much. Basically, I think my short intro to this panel is that California wants to get to net zero carbon emissions by 2045. Basically, all roads lead to electricity. So decarbonize the grid, electrify transportation, electrify building, basically electrify everything. And so if it's not going through the grid, it's connected to the grid. So the grid, if you sort of follow the logic, was really a key piece to this whole equation. And so we have a great panel with us here today to talk about various aspects of the grid, from the distribution system to the transmission system, and the legal regulatory, I was going to say morass, but maybe the legal regulatory environment that we find ourselves in. So we have Sandeep Aujla, the Director of Fire Science and Climate Adaptation with SDG&E. Yes. We have Omar Bustami, attorney at Mintz, and first Mark Rothleder, getting inferred from Darwin. So I think we're going to go in this order, right? Jason, I think that's what you're correct here. So I think without further ado, let's get cracking. How will operate the same way that we operate? So questions at the end. Andy, can I get...
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Andy Aujla, Director of Fire Science and Climate Adaptation. We have had some of you last year, I think in these 2 years, to the breakfast and to go deeper into what my team and I are doing at SDG&E. It gives me great pleasure today to just really share our perspective on how we think about grid experience, especially in terms of adaptation. And that's a little bit of how we're thinking about in detail today. Really next slide. So before we jump into that, refreshing on SDG&E. We spoke about 3.7 million customers and Sandeep or Southern Orange County. How about operating running at square miles, this Everstar trade, we do that through 1.5 million liters, initial meeting in about 1 million past liters. We have about 46,000 regulators, and our focus has always been safety, ultimate DNA, and reliability, and increased media probability of much. So this is something we touched on from the law, that the budget that we are faced with is changing rather than rapidly. And as some scientists like say, in very puzzling ways, more of uncertainty. So NOAA and NCEI are tracking the really wasting data. And I was looking at it last night, they track billion-dollar disasters, and numbers are staggering. So their tally for last year was about 93 billion, 28, and those still tallying. They've been tracking this as 1980 billion disasters when touching another. And the numbers were, I think, 376 billions, close to 2.6 trillion dollars. And now in the UK methodology and the assumptions, is it conservative because the cost and crisis do not create more costs, and by the way, easily about disasters, not COVID disasters linked to weather and time. So as we think about the future of the grid, we have to think about how we adapt to this environment. And we talk really about mitigation solutions, but clearly we can't adapt all the elements. So we've think about two-hand concept. And we've been doing all of that at SDG&E because uninterruptible power is absolutely a prerequisite in the resilience, which is the why of identity, the so what tomorrow is. The next study. For those of you familiar with the work SDG&E is leading in wildfire mitigation planning, it is one of those areas where we do have some research and understanding emerging experience. And so what you're doing in climate adaptation is detecting a lot of understanding of what that means for all hazards. For areas beyond the high-fire threat districts. So we are looking at new ways of leveraging academic partnerships, and one way academia is absolutely using brilliant research, and we're very lucky to have all data of innovative students and the AO. Our national labs are increasingly building in these goals. Scientists can give about equity, our laws, the climate. So the important thing is as this data and information becomes available, how do utilities access it, how do we act upon it, how does it inform our decision making. So there's a lot of that partnership and collaboration happening. We are also trying to leverage all of our situational awareness capability when it comes to our weather network. So, a very dense weather station network, about 220 high density weather stations at the service territory. We've got clouds and top cameras. And we are also now leveraging AI, intelligent processing, LiDAR imagery. So there's a lot of data coming at us. And the idea is we will gathering all of it for Wi-Fi resilience and how do we repurpose it for resilience against all hazards. And that is where the teams now maintaining and created the Wi-Fi counter specific division last year. And that's where all three teams, emergency management and improvement. It was not really science and research, a lot of it is really planning and response, but a lot of it is also going to be on the ground storms. So we had tropical storm Hillary last year, what did we learn from it? And what's an after action reporting? How you build on it, because models can be wrong. I mean, by design, there's a lot of assumptions, a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot to learn on the job. And that is where we are integrating all of our thinking with our districts and engineering teams, with our IT teams, and building all our lessons learned from Wi-Fi. Next slide. So just to go into a bit more detail about what we're doing with climate adaptation. In California, the adaptation OIR was introduced in 2018. And utilities have been asked to work very closely with the CalAdapt engine. So those to roll off bring in the CalAdapt, it is funded through OPR. Thankfully, even with the latest budget, funding is guaranteed because there are always some very things to learn. There's a lot of data, so those of you who track water, particles, IPCC, a lot of very high computing, visualization layers, global level, they're getting downscaled and reviewed, adopted for local level resilience planning. So Canada is doing a lot of that translation in terms of which rules apply to California, and also how do you think about certain hazards at certain locations. And those resolutions keep getting refined, and the idea is for us to use that latest and greatest science as we think about a vulnerability assessment. So up in the chart, pi means the exposure. That's I'm talking about climate science, cloud status, and that in itself is changing. For the longest time, your IPCC was referencing just the RCP, the reference filtration pathways, height to GHG, and it has solely not from the very social economic impact place. But that has changed dramatically in the last 5 years. And now there is more joined up view on how societies will respond to greenhouse gas emissions and the warming planet. So for utilities, we need to integrate what our people considers powers of scenarios of the societal response, which again is not easy because this isn't, we have staff of climate scientists or researchers, but we are to get smarter because we are being required now to think about affordability and the optimization and the efficiency of our capital allocation. So we cannot ignore the size. We cannot ignore what asset basis for per means and what community resilience, again, that is our social license spot, where it means at global level. So we are also integrating this view of exposure to hazards made available to CalAdapt and USGS as also studying sea level rise, extreme temperatures, extreme precipitation, atmospheric rivers, that's a change point. And we are also been learning about asset health data, and working with engineers to understand how does this exposure result to sensitivity and then to a vulnerability score. And once you understand the vulnerability, you've got to then think about the response and the mitigation. And by the way, as you think about all of it, you've got to make sure at a local level there is buy-in from communities. And as you're thinking about solutions, you're also thinking about economics, job creation, impacts that are really for at local level. So that's the work. SDG&E is going to file its community engagement plan very soon this year. We are treating Edison and PG&E the one before us. And then next year they'll file a very detailed vulnerability assessment of our climate adaptation vulnerability assessments, which will look not just at our infrastructure assets, but also services operations and the vulnerability of the communities we serve. So experience on. So I don't like to, how we leveraging was by in my comedy culture with this. So re-expanding operations, we had been at it for 10 years, thinking about influence outputs, probabilities of ignition, probability of failure, assets, and then consequences. So we are building on top of that inputs and outputs understanding and extending it to our vulnerabilities on self to kind of action and change. So what is interesting there is how do you do this in a manner which is repeatable? So we are working very closely with the innovation team to do this in a sort of data-rich architecture where you have average data, where you have community-led data, and you understand, vulnerabilities from what has been defined by the regulators to environmental screens or city standard or electricity screens. The idea is to take all those inputs into account, not in a silo, but in a repeatable manner. So while fiber-digging are being formed and have asset level data, to your asset management systems, then as you bake in electrification scenarios of growth, you have a base layer understanding also of climate. So we are putting all of this information in the data mesh, creating visualization layers, leveraging the digital twin. And yes, I'm throwing a lot of rage out in the IT terms here. But the idea here that is central to all this is just understanding climate data and posting is not sufficient. You have to be actionable. We've got to work with the brilliance that's in our capability set, whether it's an IT or an enterprise risk. So climate risk and climate models is also based in related by system models as financial elements. So how do we extend our view of climate risk into an understanding of consequence, which is in financial terms, safety metrics, or reliability metrics? So there's been a lot of collaboration inside the company of crossing roads, and we are trying to make sure that all the students, not just from power fighting or community engagement planning, all the decisions are climate forms. And then think back to the challenges and why the idea in can't do it. And, these are all sort of the way that the trends that are converging. You think about electrification, you think about AI, you think about community resilience, you're thinking about reasonably affordability. These are all mega trends which require intersectional solutions. And we cannot think about just pure net zero without thinking about vulnerability and climate to be sure as we plan the system for net zero pathways. It's going to kind of heavy. So I'm excited to get a question.
Great, thank you so much. I'm talking about how to feel like nothing. Yeah, the thing, as Jason noted, I've been here at Sydney for with 20 years to this version. The fact that SDG&E as meteorologists and all kind of climate science, the collaborativity is remarkable. So thank you for that. Omar is going to talk to us about. So we heard a little bit, of course, the keynote and the first panel, some hints that this is a highly regulated industry, and so if you want to work in this industry, you have to navigate all of that regulation. And so Omar's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the regulation policy aspects and trends happening about transition.
Right, and Kinsey Duff, Mark gave an excellent overview and synopsis of grid management and planning and policy, at a very high level. And what I want to do is sort of further highlight some of the issues experienced in terms of reliability with the increased deployment of renewable resources, in particular efforts that have been made at the federal regulatory level to address those issues. And then also wanted to highlight some of the tensions between various planning approaches that might just be conceptually inherent if you choose one approach over another. So just a little bit about my law firm, Mintz. Mintz is one of the oldest energy and sustainability practices in the country. Not only do they do transactional work, over 800 deals in the last decade, but we also have deep experience in regulatory areas that relates largely to the energy field. My practice in particular focuses around representing independent power producers. I help people such as Tanya blow up the grid, and advises to strategies. Figure interconnection disputes is has been a big traditionally subject of my practice. So let's just take a step back and sort of provide a definition, because we're talking a lot about reliability. So what exactly is reliability? What are we talking about? And so here's a wonky definition from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but I think it's a good one. And in particular, skipping past the first definition, it focuses on two key elements. So you have the reliable operation, but then you also have resource adequacy. So you're talking about reliable operation. That relates to another term we've heard here, resiliency, right? So it's a grid that has the ability to withstand, sudden electric system disturbances that can lead to blackouts. But then you also have resource adequacy, right, which is procuring enough energy to meet your demand. And then, you have dispatchability, which is a big portion of that. So that'll kind of lead to the next slide. So traditional reliability issues, from increased reliance on renewable, you heard a lot of it already today with our speakers. But renewable resources traditionally have been, entirely intermittent, variable, depending on circumstances that are just not outside of our control. Of course, when you co-locate with a battery, it's a game changer, right? But that makes it difficult to dispatch. Obviously, we talked about it, but the electric grid, load is demanding power at certain periods in which maybe solar isn't generating always at those periods. Changing weather patterns. And then, of course, here's the transmission-related upgrade component, and the sort of the queue backlogs that are created when you have so many generators that are trying to sort of get online, and you don't necessarily have the infrastructure to support them all coming online at once. There may be upgrades that are needed to facilitate the interconnection, and depending on your planning approach, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that can create the sort of backlog issues that you hear about. Oh, the queue backlogs. Oh my God, I waited 4 years to get my project online. It's not viable anymore. And then of course some of these other issues have already, it's getting better in California and across the country, but co-locating storage with battery historically has been an issue. But now, as we heard from one of our speakers earlier, it's inherent. When you're building a solar, you always have a battery. Sometimes you just have a battery without a solar. So mitigating the reliability issues. Okay, so obviously you have your technology, your innovation, right? Cleantech San Diego sponsoring this event. It has technology in its name, literally. So that's going to be a big way of mitigating the issues, right? You have distributed energy, increased reliance on distributed energy resources, microgrids, demand response. All these things are going to help mitigate reliability issues. But then you have the planning and the regulatory reforms that are also sort of needed to happen simultaneously. So let's go into the next slide, where I'm going to just sort of give an overview of some of the major regulatory reforms at the federal regulatory level that have sort of happened. And I also wanted to take a step back and just sort of talk about the structure, because Mark obviously talked about the CAISO, but now I'm talking about FERC. And so, FERC promulgates regulations. It's a federal agency. You have transmission operators across the country. People are not always fortunate enough to have wonderful ISO like CAISO running their grid. Sometimes it's just the incumbent utility that owns the transmission system that is the transmission operator. But they have to adopt provisions and manuals and tariffs that are consistent with FERC's policies and regulations. And sometimes they deviate. They could go above and beyond. They don't have to do sets a minimum level of what might need to be done. But the transmission operators can exceed that. As Mark sort of talked about, CAISO is looking into long-term transmission planning. FERC has a proposed rule that was proposed back in 2022, so we've been waiting 2 years. We haven't seen anything from that, but that's going to be very important for promoting a more set. So you're not restricted by what the regulation hasn't come out yet. You can go above and beyond, but so we'll talk about FERC Order 222 just briefly. So that was very important for integrating distributed energy resources into the wholesale markets, allowing a platform for them to participate and sort of making it mandatory and requiring that. And then, of course, last year, July, FERC issued Order 2023, to address a lot of the interconnection backlog issues. So a lot of very wonderful reforms in that. And then of course the transmission planning entities such as CAISO or others across the country will have to file compliance filings in order to implement the requirements under that regulation. So turning to the next slide. So I just wanted to sort of talk about, from more of a conceptual level, the approaches and trade-offs. If you're a transmission planning entity, and by the way, this isn't, I'm not saying this is specifically what the CAISO or any particular entity does or doesn't do. The reality is that whatever the planning approach is, every transmission planning entity is probably going to adopt a little bit of varying approaches that are going to be tailored to the needs of their specific region. And then of course you have different theories that are on different, sides of the spectrum. So you can kind of look at this like, here's the political spectrum, you sort of have the right and the left. I'm not that any of these align with either side necessarily, but here's one: proactive investment in new infrastructure versus a build as needed approach. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that you could have a sort of a centralized planning approach where you build it and then the project developers that want to interconnect to the grid, that want to utilize the grid, will come in later, and then maybe the people that utilize that infrastructure will pay for it to the extent that they benefit for it. Versus a separate approach, which is let's wait for an interconnection request, for example, from a utility scale generator to be put into effect, and then you might have upgrades that are, for the cost for which of those upgrades are directly assigned to that specific developer or a cluster of developers that are interconnecting around the same node, so that you really didn't upgrade your infrastructure until somebody came in and said, hey, here's what we need, right? So there's obviously different trade-offs for these approaches. If you build it, in theory they'll come, but maybe they never come, and then who pays for the cost of that infrastructure? But then if you wait for people to ask, then maybe that contributes to additional queue backlogs. You have the flexible interconnection approach, which is what you see them doing in Texas. Don't mess with Texas, right? So, which is basically, okay, we'll conduct studies, build infrastructure, generators come in and want to interconnect, rather than guaranteeing them capacity injection rights. Basically, let's say a generator has 100 megawatts, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to give you 100 megawatts of injection rights on the grid, the grid operator might say, no, I'm going to tell you your risk of curtailment. So that could affect the project economics, but at least the developer will go back and say, hey, we have a 50% risk of curtailment. Does that mean that are we still viable? Sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no, but they might not be waiting in line in a long queue. So if you're guaranteeing everybody their injection rights, that's great, but maybe the line will be a little bit longer. So, not to be cliche, but you really can't have your cake and eat it too all the time. And then of course there's socialized cost allocation, which relates to the last point, versus customer self-funding. If you're going to wait for projects to be approved, and then socialized across your rate base, that you might just say, I'm impatient, I would rather just self-fund and get it done and get it built. And the important thing I think to highlight in all of this is that the state-driven policy goals and affordability are not necessarily aligned with reliability. Those things might naturally be in tension. But obviously, the job of the planners and the stakeholders is to try to figure out how to, bridge that gap between those things. So I think that's a very important thing, and thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll try not to be repetitive, but I will be repetitive. I'm trying to be a little bit, use the graphics here to emphasize a couple of points. And I think the first slide here is just kind of hitting the point that Scott talked about earlier and I talked about earlier, and that is, as we do this transition, and I agree with Scott, that the grid is kind of you do that first, you decarbonize the grid, and then you decarbonize other sectors by transitioning off of fossil fuels and so forth. So as you do that, it does create a downward trend of carbon emissions. From an operational perspective, it does create now the higher demand where the grid is going to have to carry more electricity to serve these new demands. whether it be electric vehicles or building, heating and cooling that was once provided by fossil fuels. So this is the trajectory. We understand it. It's really important that we keep up with it and make sure that the grid is decarbonized enough so that you are not then serving electric or loads that expect to be served by the electric system, and then doing it by using fossil fuels to generate. So it's a sequencing problem, and that's why we have to keep this thing moving in terms of the direction. Excellent. So, as I alluded to earlier, we like to think that we are off of and migrating off of fossil fuels, but the reality is that we still need a large capacity of dispatchable fossil fuel resources. And in our system, we've got about 31,000 megawatts, 31 gigawatts of capacity that is still gas resources. In other jurisdictions, they're moving off of coal and kind of transitioning to gas. We are in the transition from gas to pure renewable clean energy resources. Nonetheless, these resources are being used less than less. Okay, so the capacity factors on this gas fleet is significantly reducing. And as a result of that, we have to think about the types of gas resources we want in the system. It's no longer a good idea to have resources that take 3 days to start, have to run for 7 days as a minimum. You want resources that start quickly, to turn off quickly. You only need to use them when you need them. If I translate that into resources that are deeper into the customer system, and just the thought experiment, and this is, we all think about bugs, diesel generators, that they're not very clean. You don't want to use them very often. But if you think about if we could use those backup generators, and there's 15,000 megawatts of backup generators in California, if we can use those for a few hours instead of using a gas resource for days on end, is that a better utilization? Is that a better outcome than potentially continuing to keep some of the gas resources around that are less flexible, that don't have co-benefits for backup power? It's just something to think about as we think about the strategic reserve that the state's thinking about. Can we leverage and maybe decarbonize some of those backup generators and make better use of them so that we don't have to maintain some of the gas fleet that is not as flexible? So, thought process. Operationally, we think about this on a daily basis, and this is just kind of a typical day in a summer day. You'll notice here there's a big amount of clean energy in the middle of the day. Sun goes down, and now how are you replacing that clean energy? You can see here what's moving. We've got gas thermal resources having to be dispatched up. We've got imports that we have to dispatch in. Some of that is clean, some of it is not. And then the new kid-in-the-block batteries are starting to play a role in navigating that evening 6 to 8 p.m. Period. How do we, next slide please, how do we utilize the batteries? So we charge them in the middle of the day when we have that surplus solar energy. Makes total sense. Otherwise we would curtail that energy because we don't have anywhere to put it, or it's become it's behind transmission constraints. So co-located resources totally make sense. Charge up the battery, and then in the evening you discharge that battery. More and more you're going to start to see two discharge periods: morning load pull and evening load pull. So the question is, if we start getting into 2 times a day where we have to discharge, how are you going to charge that battery at the middle? And what are you going to charge with it? So that's something to start thinking about. and starts putting in the mode where 4-hour batteries may not be enough, may be longer duration. And what? Using the diversity of the regional resource mix and the demand mix. Not everybody keeps the same time across the region. You got seasonal change, you got seasonal differences, and you got intraday differences, where even a few hours or an hour difference makes a difference. Leveraging that diversity, load and supply diversity in the Western Energy and Metals market has been very effective of better utilizing resources and coordinating these resources across the West. In a way, it also allows us to use the regional system as a battery. If we stored energy in the Northwest in one season and get it back in another season, that's using the regional system as a battery. So another illustration of the solution set is multidimensional, and you have to go all the way from the consumer to the multiple large regional solutions for really navigating this transformation. Next slide, please. So I talked about some 120 gigawatts of resources, and this kind of gives you the trajectory of what types of resources we're talking about. You'll see here there's a large amount of solar production, but kind of along with that solar development goes along with the storage. We have saturated in many ways just being able to integrate more solar into the system. Integrating more without the storage becomes counterintuitive and not helpful. So doing it with storage allows you to move and use that abundance of energy for the easy. Wind is another thing that's starting to get developed more and more. You're starting to look at offshore wind in California, and then obviously there are wind areas in the broader West, New Mexico, Wyoming, that have nice wind patterns that kind of coincide and are producing when we are in our middle of our summer needs. Wind in California, land-based wind in California is not that great. And you have a high pressure, high temperatures, the wind drops down to near zero. And so you need to find where that's produced when you have the demand in the system you need. So offshore is helpful. Northern offshore is better than the Central Coast offshore, but then also the Wyoming and New Mexico, outside of state, things like this. So to harvest all of this, and in order to move this energy around where it's produced, when it's produced, to where it's needed, you need transmission. And it's not easy to build transmission in-state. It's not easy to build transmission out of state and across the region. The challenges are who's it benefiting, how does it get built, and who's paying for it. So we've been actually fairly successful in the last few years in using our planning process and identifying some regional transition projects highlighted here by women that are trying to get some additional capability of moving energy around, whether it be in interior irrigation district and getting access to geothermal, or some projects in ZIA getting out to New Mexico, or Trans-West Express getting out to Wyoming. These are large projects, and they need innovative solutions to get developed. And I think we've found some new innovative ways to do that. This is an interesting slide. This just illustrates that exponential rise in interconnection requests. You can see here at the last two cluster opportunities, cluster queue opportunities. So we do it as a cluster. We found that doing it sequentially just doesn't make sense anymore at the scale that we're at. So we do it as a cluster every year or every 2 years, the last couple of years. There's an opportunity to put requests in for connections, And you can see here that there's an abundance, 300 and 500 megawatts of new resources, little number of queues with 150 gigawatts, 354 gigawatts. Yes, those are hundreds of gigawatts of requests. We're talking about needing 120 gigawatts over a 20-year period. So you can see there's plenty of resources wanting development. The question is, how do we get those studied? How do we get the ones moving in the right places? And how do we coordinate it properly with the transmission that's being built and developed, and ultimately coordinate it with procurement, because it makes absolutely no sense if you go build a transmission line to an area and then someone goes and makes a contract with a resource in the queue that doesn't have transmission deliverability. So you got to coordinate all those things together, all the way from resource planning to transmission planning to ultimate procurement. So I think you have alluded to this fact that there's not one solution that's going to fix all this and get us navigate all this. It's going to take multiple solutions and a lot of innovation. And I appreciate some of the work that you're doing, because even that work has provided additional benefits. We're leveraging that in terms of our forecasting capability. It's much more difficult to forecast on a daily basis what the load's going to be tomorrow, let alone what it's going to be in 10 years out. And having this additional capability and this new visibility is really important to that forecasting. And forecasting matters, because if you don't get the forecast right, you don't get the resources committed online right, and if you don't get those resources committed in alignment right, then you run into those reliabilities. So it's all about dealing with and managing uncertainty in all time shifts.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. I want you to do your thing. Okay, great. All right. All right. Mark, maybe let's take what you mean to start. So you mentioned, maybe a two-part question, too much on you, but you mentioned your earlier comments about the short-term storage working well for most autumn, and then you just now mentioned long-term. Could you talk a little bit more about the need for long-duration storage? And then the second part is, you mentioned new technologies and innovations that are helping these longer transmission projects. Can you talk a little bit about those as well and listen to those innovations? Sorry, two-parter. two unrelated part questions.
Yeah. So, unfortunately, we use terms like short duration or long duration, and then you can break out long duration into 5 segments. I described one of those, and that is having something like an 8-hour battery to take you through that multiple need for 2 discharges per day. Maybe 8 to 12-hour batteries is something that you want to use for that. But there's also a longer term, there's going to be a need, as you retire the gas fleet, there's going to be seasonal storage need. If you don't have the ability to fire up a gas plant on demand, you need to be able to have really long duration where you store energy for a season or multiple years, in the case of managing drought, or multiple days where you have no solar, cloud cover, no wind production. You got to be able to ride through those times. So there's probably longer duration, which talking about like things like traditionally is storing in hydro systems, pump storage systems, but also there's newer technology being developed, like in the air batteries, form energies, 100 hours of storage, and basically rusting and derusting systems and getting energy out of it. So there's a lot of innovation at various timescales the reason 4-hour batteries, lithium ion, are working because the price has come down so much that mobility has driven the price of battery down. But it may not be the best technology in the long run to cover the full scale of needs for the electric grid. The second question about the transmission and some of the innovative ways of developing new transmission, financing new transmission. So transmission's expensive. Everybody wants it. Everybody wants to be paid to build it. No one wants to pay for it. And the reality is that you have to overcome that financing and need capability. And some of the new innovative ways that we've come up with and avoiding having, I'll say, California through its transmission access charge, which is charged to all demand plus exports, having a burden for it is really coupling it with the developers of the resources. So resources want transmission to get to their customers. Customers are wanting to contract with resources and ensure that it's deliverable. So if the creative way is a subscription method of participating transmission model is that those who are those developers of resources needing the transmission to get to the customers will effectively sign up and help pay for and finance transmission. They will embed that in their power purchase agreements. So ultimately, consumers and load is ultimately paying, but it's targeted there rather than having the entire load through a transmission access charge picking up the cost of that new transmission. It's just another way of overcoming it and tying it together with the resource development. Because if you don't overcome interest in that resource development, you're not going to develop that transmission. So they kind of go hand in hand. They're coordinated as a result of that. So that SPTO or subscriber participation model is one mechanism, innovative mechanism that we've come up with. And it allows us then to, the participating people, that is the transmission, it does become participating in that it does allows us to optimize it as a market operator, but it doesn't have to all be incorporated into the transmission access charge, which is getting fairly expensive. So it creates another pathway of getting over that financing mechanism and capability. There are other ways, but we need more creative ways, and certainly the government with the IRA and some of the financing is also interjecting some additional mechanism of trying to overcome some of the financing challenges of transmission.
Thank you. Sandeep, let's go to you. Mark kind of teed up this idea, I had written it down earlier, about how much does your work around impacts and, for example, like heat predictions or things like that, how much does that inform your planning, resource planning, or even procurement around, like, how it makes sense to me that it's around fires and fire risk and that sort of thing, but how much is this massive becomes?
That's quite interesting question. So I think CEC, other state agencies, making realize that also that the last adaptation area, how is it informing the IRP? How is it informing your electrification planning down? So they have now gone into this coalition like represented SDG&E on the Team Advisory Council, which happens at CAISO, CCs, others, to think about how are we going to look at the demand side and take the climate data that we're coming up with to make sure our heating degree days and the cooling degree days, and not based on 30-year historical averages, looking at the next 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years, understanding the uncertainty, but not always looking backwards, have the solution for this decade. Now, if all of that work that's being done by this TAG as part of the CPC plan is going to be made in the next few years, but there's a lot of thinking and throwing into it before it goes into the workshops. Tetris is coming. What we do in SDG&E is making sure that we're not waiting 2 years for that to come out in a regulatory environment. We are talking to our rates group. We are talking, as I said, to our planning group, so that we handle the trade a bit. The idea is if we understand climate data, separating what is just a transitory, event to, this is systemic, and we need new transformers in this time frame. So that is starting, but it's early days. And I think the regulation that's coming, whether it's through the RP and procurement, is going to accelerate it, and rightfully so. Right? And then going back into constructing and hardening, making sure if you're choosing a particular hardening strategy, not just a wildfire, is it all difficult when it comes to sea level rise, flooding, and extreme heat. And then lastly, when you are doing all this, understanding how you will inform children's communities and how you're working your CBOs, community outreach groups, see people in customer programs who are targeting the AFN population with outreach on wildfire, but other sorting affiliation. So yes, it's coming, but to your point of the demand and supply side, I believe the climate adaptation IR is actually that is a result in more for tends to climate resilience.
Okay, thank you. Omar, this whole event and this panel is looking kind of a forward-looking event. Do you have any thoughts? I mean, what's coming down the line in terms of the regulation and policy? What's either in the works or in the pipeline? Or, what do you see, in the coming years that will affect the conversation around this? It's sure. Cool.
So I think that some of it, was touched on already, in the sense that, we have a pending rulemaking from FERC that everybody's, holding their breath for. We're going to see more long-term transmission planning integrated in sort of the various regional approaches. I also foresee, and I guess before wishful thinking, I'm hoping that there will be more creative approaches for allowing, sort of new projects to get online without having to necessarily get in the back of the line in the queue. We had mentioned earlier of special transmission projects in new regions that developers, wanting to build in those areas, they can sort of, they don't have to get into, they can be in their own queue, or they don't have to get into, the expedited or a waiver to sort of, get the project online quicker. And then maybe we actually have already sort of been seeing this in other regions of the country, such as in the Midwest, where you have new generators wanting to sort of repurpose existing interconnection rights to come online, where the old project, it's not the same resource. So you might have had a gas-fired plant, and then you have someone wanting to come online. I mean, we mentioned earlier, Omar, sorry to keep alluding to, you said so many great things. So, but you mentioned the sort of storage through rusting and re-rusting process. So it would be great to see someone wanting to repurpose interconnection rights for a gas-fired generator to put a storage technology like that on an existing site without necessarily having to get in the back of the line to a queue. There's already interconnection rights there. So queue jumping has been, is always a major issue from a fairness and, standpoint. Procedurally, you're discriminating against other people that were in line ahead of you. So, but, sometimes there's, like I said, there's trade-offs. So the benefits of, allowing to repurposing generators that might be retired with new generators that can come in, I could maybe outweigh some of the unfairness that would come with someone getting, having to, I've been in line to get online for a long time and I'm not online yet. So I think those are the types of things, like more creative approaches that we might see going forward. Honestly, Mark probably knows what's coming forward. So
Jason, you want to take some?
Yeah, maybe some audience questions report. Yeah. Okay. Or did you want to add anything there?
No, I mean, this whole topic of queue management, the bus fare, what's equitable, what do you do with the higher resources that the LOD, or our payment when we made routes. The question is, who gets to develop around that transmission that's now available? And it's a tricky question, and in some ways, their perspective, depending on where you stand, is kind of what we are seeing out there. And so this is part of our interconnection policy enhancements that we're going through right now. How do we do that? How do we fast track those opportunities where transmission is consciously being developed in areas and zones, and make sure that if you're in a site in those locations, those things can move forward potentially at a faster pace, and unlock those things, because something has to happen. You just can't keep going the way you are and have that CO not being processed.
Surely we learned something how about Taylor Swift concert tickets, right? Push over there.
Then we'll just put out different mess.
Bob, you can see an RGR where that fix the car while driving. You will get a stumpy traffic count every day, and so we need to build more freeways, we need to expand the lanes. In the not too distant future, we're going to have autonomous cars, or we're going to have a bunch of spare lanes, and for the total a lot of money into. When we talk about connection and development, all we risk is going down the same path while deploying a lot of distributions. Energy resources is those environment, and I'm sure deploy capital at least.
Yeah, you're always you have to be conscious of the risk of stranded assets, but I think this transformation is so dramatic, so large, and you can see that with conversion of fuel switching and electrification, there's a certain amount that we know we're going to need. And there's this kind of, we use term no regrets, whatever regrets. We try to minimize those regrets, but you've got to make those big decisions. Otherwise, if you don't make those decisions, you're not moving forward. So is there a risk that there's so much distributed energy resources that it reduces or displaces the need for these new transmission? I don't think so. I think you're going to see a need for both. You're going to need the distributed energy resources, and they will develop, and the new load will develop at the distribution level. And you're going to need new transmission to do a wider range of diverse resources around the system, from where they're being produced to where and when they're needed. So I'm fairly confident that the type of transmission that we're talking about is a low, no regret type of transmission.
Carson?
I had a segue question actually talk about that. There's so many technologies that are almost maybe even can still be described as like somewhat fictional, but are happening in the next year or two. Companies that we work with that are going to actually change the way we operate as people. A fusion is at the domain target. And so when it happens, and there are generators getting devices being built by factories and rolling off like cards to get onto the grid, how does the transmission and distribution network deal with the technology that literally was up in the way we did radio there? I think that is a question I could ask, even though it's potentially something that says, well, prove that it is, but would it exist? It'll be 3 years to change the entire grid.
I gotta operate the grid I have. Yeah. And as a result of that, yes, I can watch for those innovative things and hope they develop, and they will develop. But in my 1 to 10 year horizon, I got to deal with what I have and what's plausible. So I'm not planning right now for something like fusion to be out there and develop. Now, in 5 years, when it becomes now more viable and it becomes potentially commercially possible in the horizon, we can adjust at that point. But at that adjustment point, I operate at least 10 years reliably with what I do have.
Yeah.
So you just gotta think strategically and keep moving along and stay in the realm of reality and let the researchers do their research, and as it becomes viable, adjust at that point.
I think it's like that question one more. Is there room for the transmission and distribution network to help accelerate this to come and to highlight that?
I think there is. I mean, certainly fusion, depending on how it develops, and I'm not focusing on that. Let me just say traditional nuclear. Okay, we're probably not going to be developing traditional nuclear in California anytime soon. My career horizon. But there are small nuclear resources that are going to be developing outside of the state. Well, if that happens, don't we want to take advantage of being able to move that energy around the system where it's been needed? Same thing with wind, as I described earlier. There's great wind sites. They may not be in California, but don't we want access to those? And the transmission just allows you to have access to those and move those around and develop where it's logical, where it's rational, and with the energy around, and get the diversity balance of the things to do that.
Great. I think that was our final question. Let's thank the panelists.